Hello, and welcome to World Energy Week Live 2021. Our session is Turning Points in the Global E-Mobility Transition. I'm Mark Duvall from the Electric Power Research Institute, and I'll be moderating a great panel of speakers from North America who will give you a perspective on what is happening in this part of the world. Let me first say that as the electrification of transportation is accelerating on many fronts, the primary drivers of technology, national policy, rapidly evolving product, and decreasing costs. So we're going to talk about some of the things that are necessary to take where we are today and take the very large and very challenging next steps and achieve some of the opportunities that are there for the transportation industry and sector in terms of decarbonization through electrification. So our panelists are Britta Gross. She's the managing director of Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, in the United States. She is a veteran of General Motors, where she worked on their vehicle electrification and their hydrogen fuel cell programs. She is currently based in Orlando, Florida, where she is also an appointed utility commissioner for the Orlando utility. Rodolfo Guzman is the managing partner of the Americas at Arthur D. Little. He is going to speak about some of the activities in Latin America, and he is based in Houston, Texas, in the United States. Ashley Horvat is the Vice President and Head of E-Mobility for North America for Schneider Electric, also in the United States. She was formerly with Greenlots, one of the pioneering EV infrastructure networking providers in the United States, and came into this space, or at least came into onto our radar first as the electric vehicle czar for the state of Oregon. And then finally, Michael Barabee, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Sustainable Transportation in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the Department of Energy in the United States. So welcome all, and I'm looking forward to our discussions. We'll start with a few remarks, opening remarks, and we'll start in that order. So Britta, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you, and welcome to World Energy Week.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Great to be here. Welcome, everybody. To this great panel. Love this topic. Of course, the world is a different place today than it was even just a couple of years ago. So it's a really exciting time to be in electrification. Here in the United States, we are right at about 2 million electric vehicles on the road. Of note is that it took us about 7 years to get to the first 1 million electric vehicles on the road. And it took us only about 4 years to get to that second million electric vehicles. So that's positive news. But if we want to get on a path to contain temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C, we're really now talking about large scale electrification. And our numbers suggest that that means we've got to be at about 1 in 4 vehicles on the road being electric in 2030 to have the kind of impact we need to have. That's about 70 million electric vehicles on the road. Today, we're at about 2% new vehicle sales being EVs. We have to see those numbers grow to 25% by 2025 and beyond to get onto a pathway that looks much more accelerated to get to the kind of volume we're talking about. There are signs that there's growing support for a large-scale transition sooner rather than later, and a lot has really flipped, I would just say, in the last 8 months, 12 months. You might be aware of President Biden's announcement with the big 3 automakers, GM, Ford, and Stellantis, former Chrysler. They announced just months ago that they were all aiming for 50% EV sales in 2030, by 2030. So that is now starting to show that we're bending up that curve. We're trying to get to some large scale electrification. I think that's fantastic, this government industry cooperation that we're seeing now. California, you may know, also announced a year ago that they were on a path to require 100% EV sales no later than 2035. And then maybe more surprisingly, General Motors followed up earlier this year with an announcement that they were also aiming for 100% EV sales by 2035. So again, you're seeing these powerful commitments coming to play and sort of across these sectors of government and industry. I think that's really good news right now and a very distinct change from a few years ago. And if you consider all the plant changes that, for example, a GM would have to go through, the time to tool those plants to bring in new product, you can see why their investments are already starting today and why we should start seeing bigger production numbers in the next 5 years or so. And they're not the only ones. Volvo, Jaguar, Land Rover making similar 100% announcements. Key fleet announcements, if you haven't noticed, FedEx, Amazon, UPS, Uber, Lyft, all talking about large electrification numbers, also in that very critical 2030 to 2035 time period. But of course, you can't get to those numbers unless things really start accelerating right now. The administration, the President Biden's administration has announced 500,000 EV chargers to go on the ground in the next, by 2030. Our own analysis, looking at the climate numbers, looking at where we have to get, suggests that to support those 50 million vehicles that are pretty much in line with what GM and California are talking about, to support 50 million vehicles takes about 300,000 DC fast chargers just to serve that load. So we do need to focus on scaling up as quickly as possible DC fast charging, more so even than level 2, which is a little bit easier to handle and get in the ground. If I look at the technology challenges looking forward, where are we stuck and what has to be solved pretty quickly? Well, the job gets a lot easier if we can continue to bring costs down on the batteries. We need a battery that can go about 250 miles at a minimum that costs only about, in my mind, $3,000. That's basically what you can get a new powertrain for. And so if you look at those numbers, we're talking about $50 a kilowatt hour. We've made great strides since 2006-07 on lithium-ion batteries. It started out in the $800 a kilowatt area. But those numbers have to keep pressing downward, not so that we don't have to just focus on vehicles in the luxury markets, but that these vehicles enter in the mainstream market. So we've got a lot of work to do there. Another issue that I just want to sort of raise is this issue of interoperability. It starts with just being able to sort of every consumer going to any public charging station and it feels like the same experience. You can pay the same way, et cetera. But it's also even about the standards tightening up. I continue to see after 10 years, 15 years in this market, we're still seeing interoperability issues where vehicles show up on the market that are not interoperable with or operable with all charging stations. And that means the standard has to be tightened up. We are still not at a point where the SAE standard is tight enough where anyone with a charger and anyone with a vehicle knows exactly what they're looking for. In the way the vehicle has to perform, in the way it connects with the charging stations. That has to be solved. Consumers have to believe there's basically a single network out there to use. We know the vehicle interface is complicated. We know there are command and control functions, very, very challenging. We know even the length of wire harness on the vehicle changes the speed with which signals move around that vehicle, and that can change that interface. But I think this has to be accelerated and handled really within the next couple of years because we cannot be fighting this issue, 5 years from now. Other issues, the pace of vehicle production, charger production has to increase, as well as the speed of installations. So to support the 50 to 70 million vehicles that I talked about, climate numbers would suggest we've got to be at those numbers in 2030. You may be looking at sort of 2035 for the other big numbers. But 300,000 chargers that I talked about that are consistent with other analyses out there suggest that we would need to be installing today 300,000 divided by 10 years. I'm being very generous here, divided by 52 weeks. We'd have to be installing 500 DC fast chargers every week to be on pace to get to where we need to get in 2030. So I just want to sort of leave those things with you to imagine the pace that we need to be on and how we're sort of in some ways still looking at this as a business as usual proposition. And I'll leave the rest for questions, but very happy to be here.
Thank you, Britta. That was great. Thank you for getting us started. Rodolfo, you will let us know what's happening in Latin America, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and pleasure to be here as well. And as Britta mentioned, exciting pace and very exciting things happening in the U.S., which is trying to catch up. We know that Europe and China are pushing forward very aggressively, with electrification of mobility. And the U.S. now also gaining some speed. When we talk about Latin America, is clearly a different reality. And I'd like to start by saying that we need to remember the big disparity in the income levels. The U.S. is a country that has a GDP per capita of close to $70,000. While the average in Latin America is only about $10,000, so a magnitude of 7 times lower, which means that vast majority of the population in a region like Latin America, and we'll zoom in a little bit in Mexico, cannot even afford some of the cheapest models of vehicles. When we talk about electric vehicles, which are still significantly more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles, that becomes quite a big challenge. So for me, perhaps that's going to be one of the main barriers. However, we do expect that Latin America will continue developing and pick up speed. And there are some countries that are clearly pushing forward and have aggressive goals to develop electric mobility systems. So right now, the numbers for Latin America are quite low. And by 2030, perhaps Europe, the US will be selling about more than 50% of their new vehicle sales will be electric. In Latin America, that number at the best is going to be between 5% and 10%. So it will take really a long time for Latin America to have an important penetration. No? That penetration by 2030 is going to still be around 1%. So only 1 out of 100 cars is electric. What we have seen in recent years is an important penetration of hybrid vehicles. No? And I'd like to comment that, for example, the Toyota Prius, Mexico is the third largest market for the Toyota Prius, and but there are only about 25,000 vehicles sold every year in Mexico that are hybrid. One interesting comment about Mexico, they do have a local manufacturer of electric vehicles. It's a company called Sakua. We can say it's like a boutique company producing a niche product for the market. But it's only about 50 vehicles per year, no? So the numbers are quite small. We still see that passenger vehicles, electric passenger vehicles in Latin America are targeted to the really rich segments of the population that can afford this. What are some of the challenges coming ahead? I think clearly cost. Latin America does have other options to offer lower emissions mobility, such as natural gas vehicles and LPG that are used in some countries. Infrastructure development is clearly going to be a challenge moving ahead, but regulations particularly and the need for incentives. No, I think in Europe, in the US, in many developed countries, we have seen a lot of incentive in terms of tax credits, tax subsidies, etc., for the early stages, no, of electrification, because they are needed. No, it's like the chicken and egg problem. Some governments in Latin America are thinking very hard about this, but clearly they don't have the same level of resources, no, that the big economies may have. But we're starting to see some progress. We still see some disparity. Countries like Chile and Colombia, I think they are leading the pack, while other countries like Mexico, Argentina, Brazil may be falling behind a little bit on this. What I see as the biggest opportunity in Latin America is more on the electrification of the public transportation, the introduction of e-buses for big cities, no, very large congested cities like Mexico City, Bogota, or Santiago de Chile. They are looking at electric buses as an interesting solution, and I think that's perhaps where electrification of transportation can have the greatest impact in Latin America, no, because it will move faster and it will have a good impact on reduction of emissions. So perhaps we'll have to wait a little bit for the total cost of ownership to become more competitive for electric vehicles in the region. Electric vehicles are still between 50% and even sometimes 100% more expensive than similar internal combustion cars. But we do believe that in 10 years, these numbers are going to come much closer, no? And at that time, is where we see that this is going to start to pick up. So in summary, I think Latin America is probably running like 10 years behind the more developed economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodolfo. I would ask all of our panelists to consider several of your comments for the discussion, because I think it is important. Every country, no matter how developed, has communities that have fewer resources for which to access electric vehicle technology as it becomes available. And we're in danger by leaving those communities behind. Those residents can't receive the benefits from this transition. So this is certainly something we want to talk more about in a few minutes. So thank you. Ashley, as a representative of a major global supplier for both electric vehicle infrastructure equipment and electrical and grid infrastructure equipment. We're really interested in hearing your perspective on what has to happen over the next few years. Ashley?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Good to see everybody on the screen. I guess just to start, I mean, it wouldn't be, I don't think it wouldn't be relevant if I didn't say, I hope everybody's staying safe, not just on this panel, but across the world. I know that everybody is challenged mentally, health, physical, with the pandemic. My heart really goes out to everyone suffering around the world from hurricanes and earthquakes and flooding and everything that is going on. I couldn't imagine a more important time to really focus and to take this serious, and I know everybody on this panel for a while, so I know that we all take it seriously, and we need all of the investment of talent and time, resources into solving all of the challenges that we have. So, in my mind, joining Schneider, I mean, look, we have a transformative industry at our fingertips. It's up to us to accelerate that. We have a workforce to transform. We need to transform that workforce, not just into these skill sets that are needed to accomplish all of the challenges that Britta illuminated and others, but we also need to make that workforce more diverse and to reflect society, and all while we're in a pandemic and a climate crisis. So yeah, there's that, but we need all hands on deck. And for Schneider in particular, we know within the context, as I think Britta, you mentioned, we need to control climate change by 1.5 degrees. We see this as what the new electric world, essentially. It's decarbonized, decentralized, and digitized. So we basically need to take data and we need to consume less energy. And we need to really look at this as an opportunity to, we're going to be doubling our energy in the next 20 years, as Mark and all of us know, while the rest of the energy will flatten. So electricity is the vector, of consumption that allows us to decarbonize. So we're seeing buildings becoming more electric, IT data centers, and EV charging oftentimes with our bigger customers can sometimes be the conduit through which these conversations happen. All of our customers are on a sustainability journey, and it's not just talk, it's real, and the timeline is very aggressive. So it's up to us to kind of help them not just implement these products, but actually to gain insights from these smarter products that are more connected. So I'm seeing this electrification open up conversations. There's an immediacy. I think Britta can attest to this, and Michael and others, that we need the flexibility, but we also need to be cognizant of some of the challenges with commercialization. Unfortunately, time is not on our side in the context of e-mobility. We're still in a relatively nascent market, but there's just a frenzy of activity and companies going public and mergers and acquisitions. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of young people that want to get into this industry that have quite a bit of talent. So I think one of my recommendations would be to move fast, but also I would say challenge your assumptions, challenge your conclusions and understanding of the market, because it is moving so quickly and there's so many advances in technology within each of the companies that we're even working with for our customers. So, I think I have faith and I'm committed to this, but we definitely need all hands on deck. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. Michael, lead us into the discussion, please. Thank you.
Yeah, great comments by everyone. For those of you that, on the world stage that don't know, the Department of Energy, it has the primary R&D mission space for the U.S. government across all of physical sciences, but in particularly in this space of decarbonization. So we have the kind of leadership role here in the U.S. on developing battery technology and charging technology and hydrogen and fuel cells and bioenergy. That's the team I come from. I'd like to just maybe the opening comments, I'm going to take a little bit broader view to give you a sense of where we in the administration, the U.S. government are focused. And just to Ashley's point, we are focused with an immediate sense of urgency and a laser focus of what will it take to decarbonize all of the transportation sector. I will tell you, I spent a lot of time with our Secretary Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, also with Secretary Buttigieg and Belisack at USDA and the team at EPA. The federal government is taking a whole government approach. We are developing a comprehensive decarbonization strategy that recognizes the sense of urgency. That doesn't just say, well, let's do some things and see where it leads us, but says we have an endpoint. We are on a timeline that has been set basically by the climate crisis we are in, that we must achieve those end results. To Ashley's point, we're not being starry-eyed about it. We're not being kind of just, let's set some bold targets and just see what happens. We're methodically walking through every piece: light duty vehicles, medium, heavy duty vehicles, off-road in the United States, it's as big as aviation, the aviation sector, maritime, rail. What are the solutions? What are the technologies we need? What are the levels of electricity we need, whether that's directly for electrifying vehicles or because you're making hydrogen or because you're making biofuels? Where are those going to come from? How is that going to be distributed across the country? So we are working as aggressively and quickly as we can, laying each one of those pieces out and constantly asking ourselves, how could this fail? How could this go wrong? That's what I constantly ask my team. What are the problems? What are the things that we aren't anticipating? How do we do our best to forestall those where we can? I will say in the case of the electrification side and light duty, medium duty, we see battery electrification as well as electrification through hydrogen as being primary paths across many of the sectors. We in the US have made a commitment to build out a nationwide network of 500,000 chargers. That's not going to be all the chargers the country needs by any stretch, but it will provide a nationwide network so you can block yourself anywhere in the country, get to anywhere else in the country and be confident you have charging there. It'll provide community level charging, which is going to be dramatically needed. There's far more trips that are short trips in the communities than those longer trips. We are focused on driving down the battery cost. We have been successful. I will say our battery team, including the US National Labs, has not missed a cost target yet in the last 10 years. We are driving to those numbers that Britta talked about. We do see that light duty vehicles, as well as medium and heavy duty vehicles, will be cost comparable on a purely cost basis with internal combustion engines. The timeframes will vary, right? Maybe you're in 2028 or so for light duty. Medium duty, maybe before that. Heavy duty, short haul versus long haul will be a little different in there. Hydrogen fuel cells, we've announced a major commitment, and we lead a lot of the global initiatives to achieve $1 per kilogram of hydrogen by 2030. At that level, for the hydrogen, if we team it up with local production, the right level of storage, we believe we can actually start using hydrogen for significant pieces of transportation in the centrally fueled fleets. Maybe not in dispersed light duty vehicles, but in those centrally fueled fleets as well. And we are working aggressively on the grid side. So the Department of Energy has extensive work on the grid. We are in parallel to doing our transportation work. We are trying to achieve a goal of 100% clean electrical grid by 2035. That is a huge goal. But electrifying transportation only works from a greenhouse gas perspective if we're also achieving 100% clean grid. So we have to do these together, and that's going to require, we think very carefully about the increases in electricity, where they'll come from, not just the local distribution issues of how you get the power there, manage it, but how do we actually generate it? How do we have the transmission capability to move that across the country? So those are things we work with Mark and the EPRI team on quite a bit, but there'll be key challenges. The last thing I'll just state, beyond just light and heavy duty, given the broad nature of the audience here, I draw people's attention to just yesterday, we had a major announcement where we had multiple cabinet secretaries, the White House, CEOs of airlines, airports, fuel providers, all committing to achieve 100% decarbonization of the aviation sector by 2050, and to be producing in the United States 3 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. That will be game changing. If we hit that level in 2030, and yesterday, companies put hard dollars on the table with commitments to build out to that level, that will put us on a path of decarbonizing the aviation sector. So we need to work on every piece of the pie, if you will, not just any one piece if we're going to achieve our end goal. So with that, Mark, looking forward to the questions. And I think your comment about looking at making sure everyone, no matter even in countries like the US, have access to these technologies and the benefits of them will be critically important. So look forward to more talk about that.
Okay, thank you, Michael. That was fantastic. Thank you all for your comments. I'm going to start with, I'm going to come back to you, Rodolfo, as I mentioned, but I would like everyone to chime in. We're on a track based on all the great technology work that's happening, all the work of the OEMs. We will reach cost parity with combustion vehicles. Electric vehicles will reach cost parity with combustion vehicles. So given that even in the United States, the used car market is double the volume, more than double the volume of the used car market, even in the United States. So when we think about all the communities within the United States where people do not buy a lot of new hardware, so the good news is, for example, in the United States, probably similar to many countries, roughly 1 in 6, 1 in 7 cars changes every year. So there's a tremendous opportunity to use that volume to meet these goals. But for developing economies, for communities within those economies with fewer resources, we really have to figure that out. And Rodolfo, where do you suggest that we start? And then I'd love to hear everyone's take on this after you. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Mark. I think when you think from the perspective of a policymaker in Latin America, clearly most of the countries in Latin America want to follow the decarbonization trend. No? They want to get better environment, reduce emission, have cleaner air. There are a lot of problems associated with that, and some countries are working very aggressively. Now, the big problem is limited resources. No? And so I think these policymakers need to be very smart about the strategies that they deploy and focus on those things that may have the biggest impact. No? There is a contentious debate about should we provide subsidies for electric vehicles that mainly the rich people can buy, no, in Latin America. So some governments are saying, no, we should not do that. But let's focus on some things that may have a bigger impact on the population. No? So electric buses, again. Some municipalities are focusing even on micro-mobility, providing electric bicycles or electric scooters, no, for mobility inside the cities that are very congested. So, and then there is perhaps an opportunity to have bigger impact on the corporate fleets, no, where you can have fleets of electric vehicles on the large corporations. And so slowly and gradually that will help, no, with the trend to electrify and get these benefits that we want from a cleaner environment. But the key question is, when I have limited resources, where do I deploy those resources?
Yeah, thank you. One quick follow-up is, are policymakers paying attention to individuals who drive for a living, whether they drive a truck or they drive a taxi or they somehow use vehicles for work, and they may not be part of a larger company with resources? In other words, is there opportunities there to help individuals get into vehicles that could provide them with lower operating costs, which would directly contribute to increasing their income, right?
Definitely so, no? And in some of these countries, we have already seen that many of the taxi fleets are running either on natural gas or LPG. So electrification will be the next phase, no? So yes, there's clearly an opportunity there.
Okay, thank you. Room for more comments on this topic. Ashley, would you like to go next, please?
Britta, it looks like did you want to go say something?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll jump in here. The darn mute button, right, everybody? I did it. It was me. Yeah, let me just add to that, because I think we've heard a couple comments already about sort of how else can we view this problem, because there's been a lot of attention, of course, in moving new production into the market. Those are new vehicles. You know, new car buyers already spend on average, I think it's $41,000 on the purchase of a new vehicle. So new cars are expensive. So how else can we look at the problem? And I think Rodolfo got this perfectly. There are a couple of things that we really have to look at. We've done a lot of work in India and China, 2- and 3-wheelers, or those last mile solutions. Those are on the lower end of the cost spectrum. That's where advanced battery technology can also help those solutions, much more affordable solutions, and really important in sort of low income, local community life. If you look at the medium duty vehicle area, Michael talked about this. Michael suggested that we're headed towards parity on batteries in the light duty vehicle sector, I totally agree. I've long said 2027, 2028, but that medium duty vehicle sector might actually come sooner. And that's because they have very short, very regimented duty cycles. That's where the higher upfront cost of vehicles can really get offset by the operating cost of these vehicles. Same as for taxis and ride-hailing vehicles. 3 times the amount of miles on those kinds of vehicles. So operating costs, when you have 1/3 the cost of electricity compared to gasoline, you start to see that it actually happens sooner, that you sort of cross that parity line where it actually is more affordable. So I think those are areas you want to look at. The other thing I'll just add in here to consider is when we look at electric buses, OUC, my own electric utility here in Orlando, and other utilities around the country are looking at and participating in programs where they actually help the transit agencies purchase the price to purchase the electric buses, but they take ownership of the battery on those vehicles for future use in a stationary storage role. And that's really important when we sort of look at, there's transportation, and as Michael pointed out, there's the grid. And both of these industries are really coming together very, very quickly. And the need for storage is extremely high as we look at introducing more and more renewables. So if we can find solutions that leverage, for example, big bus batteries, big truck batteries in a second life, and we make that pretty easy to do, those kinds of solutions can also help dramatically reduce the economics, especially on the upfront cost.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Ashley, please.
Sure. I know Britta had some great stuff to say, so I'm just going to follow her. Yeah, no, I mean, I think in terms, I mean, of course, I think there's some information in the Bloomberg report about leases and how important that is to kind of getting those on the used EV market in terms of, you know, the battery prices. I think the demand in 2020 for battery, I think shipments were 45% higher, you know, than the year before. So there's no doubt that based on the trajectory that we're heading in the right direction, but the window for achieving some of those net zero emissions, regardless of the demographic within that, you know, to fully electrify road transportation by 2050 is, in my mind, closing quickly. So if I were to say, you know, what can we do from a standpoint more broadly, you know, with policy action, is just we need an immediate increase in policy action, you know, writ large. 2030, Britta knows this well from her time in GM, but 2030 is, you know, I think 2 model refresh cycles away for automakers. So regardless of the political administration and Michael Barabee, it's like we were talking about the announcement that you made. It's like, what day are you not making an announcement? You're making announcements all the time, which is amazing, and so much progress and so much methodology to that progress, which is incredible and refreshing. But yeah, immediate policy action, urgent action from policy makers on heavy truck segment, which is furthest away, but Britta's right that it does have the ability to catapult pretty quickly in order to achieve that. But yeah, the automakers need certainty, policy certainty, in order to project out. And I think we're starting to bend the curve there. But that's what I would have.
Hopefully, the reconciliation bill and the bipartisan infrastructure framework that became a bill in the Senate now will be passing and will provide those policy levers. You're actually absolutely right, Ashley. And we can't do this on the back of the technology alone. We are going to need policy measures across each one of these modes. Here in the US, there are very significant policy measures that the Biden administration has asked for. So we'll see if those come through. I would like to just, I think, Rodolfo, to your point, we're never going to solve the climate crisis if we don't solve it globally, right? The US could eliminate all its emissions tomorrow, but it needs everyone. We need to help bring everyone along. We have to recognize the realities of the resources. And I think the used car market is worth spending just another second on that. The average cost of a vehicle, right? For the new vehicle, if you look at the upfront cost and operating cost, what that ratio is, you know, more in the upfront cost. If you look at a used car, the operating cost and the repair cost, especially, are a bigger chunk. And that's where electric vehicles shine. They are dramatically lower on the longer term repair cost, operating cost, maintenance cost. So I think there is an opportunity in markets where there aren't as many resources per capita to focus somewhat on some of those used vehicles to focus on the medium duty vehicles where there's an economic benefit and you can support local and small businesses as well from a policy perspective. And it gives you a chance to start building out the infrastructure and start moving, if you will, kind of the beachhead strategy, which is honestly I'm so happy about the move to in the proposed legislation to heavily electrify school buses and transit buses in the US. They'll provide immediate benefits to those communities, like the health benefits for the people where these buses operate around, the students that are in them. But they'll also these are federal dollars, are helping jumpstart the charging, the local battery production in the United States, the processing, all those things to again help jumpstart the industry. So it's kind of a dual-pronged strategy in some of those. That might be also some things in Latin America that make sense as well, where you work focus on those larger vehicles and then those batteries become things that help the grid for grid storage, and then they help get the charging infrastructure started.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's look. Let's get out the crystal balls. What are we doing today or the next year or two from each of your perspective? In 2030, when we've reached these goals, what will be the most important things to have gotten right today? And Britta, we're going to start with you because I think you're going to go first anyway. But and you talked a little bit about these in your opening remarks, but take one or two things that absolutely have to get right today, and how will we have done it? How would we have been successful that leads to the result in 2030 that we want? And so please, Britta, go ahead and start us off. But I would also like to hear from everyone on this as well, too.
I mean, one thing, it's a couple, but I guess let's focus on infrastructure, right? I mean, let's just presume that between the Department of Energy and the national labs and the automakers and the battery makers, cost is number one priority, and it's going to come down. It's going to benefit every single application, including the value of the used vehicles in the used vehicle market. So let's just focus on infrastructure because it is not seamless today. Nothing about it's seamless, right? It's not interoperable. You have different sort of networks. You can't interchange the RFID cards. I mentioned before that the vehicles aren't just automatically interoperable. We just haven't tightened up the standards tight enough to rule out tolerance stack-ups and other things that can happen when you take two pieces of equipment and make them together, or the electrical signals as well. It goes into the permitting and the grid interconnect timelines. We've got schedules, and Ashley knows this too from her time at Greenlots for sure. We're looking at like 170 work days in some states to actually get a permit. And I think it's 150 days on average in the country to get a grid interconnect. These might sound fine in a sort of business as usual sense. And there are a lot of reasons for it. We want safe charger stations in public locations. We have to make sure that everything's safe. It takes time to look at the capacity requirements of a grid load at a certain intersection or a certain property. These things take time, I understand it. But these worlds don't match when we've got some goals coming up, some targets that are pretty meaningful. And so we've got to rethink the way we do business. Are we staffed up? Have we really explored the stuff that must be part of a permitting exercise and the stuff that just doesn't have to be part of the permitting exercise? And of course, here in the United States, these things are pretty complicated, right? There's no sort of federal jurisdiction over either one of these things, permitting or grid interconnect stuff. So you're dealing with 3,200 utilities, and you're dealing with, I think, over 20,000 local jurisdictions. And so it is complicated, but that's no excuse for not figuring out what is the best possible safe process. Let's take off the table the things that don't have to be considered like aesthetics, et cetera. And let's get this stuff in the ground and figure out a process that'll work to get us to the scale we need.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So safe, seamless EV infrastructure everywhere there's an EV. Ashley?
Yeah, no, I think Britta, you touched on all the really critical points. I think because of the time constraints, I do think simplification. I would agree that the complexities need to be acknowledged, but prioritizing which elements of those complexities pose the greatest risk. Is that cybersecurity? Is that shoring up our grid infrastructure? Is it getting the automakers to kind of take ownership of the user experience? And I think some automakers have taken different approaches. And I think we're seeing a shift in the infrastructure side of things to where I would say who is spearheading that experience is shifting. And they're complementing one another. In some cases they're augmenting, but you know, we're seeing the OEMs really, the stakes are so much higher, because now that they're going from previously more in a compliance mode to actually completely transforming how they do business and which types of vehicles they sell and where they sell them. North America has the confluence of all of the favorable conditions to help them succeed. However, there's still challenges from a commercialization standpoint. So I think the more that we can have an open network of charging, and I've been advocating that for a long time, I think it's great to have multiple players, but as we start to get to greater penetration, we are going to need to focus on the technological complementing each other, roaming, whatever that looks like. So yeah, I would just say focusing on investing on what matters. You know, I think what we're seeing with our customers is, what can we do today to do more with less? Because, you know, you have these kind of tactical questions that come up in these meetings where you're trying to do something big that's going to prepare a customer for the future, but budgetary, whether it's CapEx, OpEx. And so it's thinking creatively about what can you put in place today on that panel that's going to allow them to build for the future in which they're inhibited right now, but how can we help enable each of these people within their organization to become that vocal leader that we need them to be, so that it's easier to turn the switch, to flip the switch, to be, you know, have, whether it's a microgrid or, you know, integrating solar panel into the charging. I mean, there's so many different things you can do, but I would say doing more with less in 2021, so that in 2030 and 2040 and beyond, we can really catapult them into this futuristic scenario where everybody is connected, electrified, and the grid is beautiful and updated and modern, Michael, once we get, you know, DOE a few more years under our belt here. And I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you. Michael.
The things we have to worry about right now, right? There's going to be things that we have to do continually between now and 2030, 2035. We have to continue building charging, but there are some things that if we don't do now, we just can't catch up on. The R&D cost, R&D to get the battery cost down, because the next 5 years of R&D will be the batteries that we have in 2030, right? It takes a while. So we got to keep pushing hard on the R&D right now there. We have to, I worry about building out EV chargers, but I worry more about making sure we have a blueprint, if you will, of how we have a large-scale grid charging network that works with a very high renewables grid and keeps costs down. Because if costs don't come down, the whole thing will stall. So having smart charging, smart charge management, utility to vehicle to being industrial customer, we got to work that out now so that we know what we're building out over the next 10 plus years. I think those are two of the biggest. And the third one, because it's so long lead, is we need to develop a more diversified raw material processing ecosystem. And that's true in North America, and it's true in Europe as well. Honestly, I think North America and Europe maybe need to team up here a little bit together, working with our partners in Latin America as well. If we don't do that now, we will run into raw material shortages, or we'll run into, quite honestly, the same situation we had for decades with petroleum, where you have choke points in the overall system that cause price spikes, spikes that just cause massive disruption, will slow down the penetration. So I think we in the US are going to focus aggressively on developing a US-based processing of raw materials. And that processing point is probably more important than the raw material availability question itself. And that will then allow us to have, I think, a lower cost, more stable battery production piece. If we don't get on that now, we literally have like a year or two to start that in an aggressive way, or it will be too late to hit these 2030, 2035.
Okay, great. Daunting, but great. Great comments. Thank you. Rodolfo.
Yeah, I fully agree with comments from the other panelists. I think perhaps what we need to get right now is to foster an environment of innovation. I think it's important to create the conditions, both from the private sector and the public sector, where there is a very entrepreneurial spirit, where we have good ecosystems of collaboration, a lot of startups, people looking at the technology angles, at the business models, new players in the market. This will by itself create a snowball effect, no? And I think one of the good news when we talk about electric mobility is once a customer shifts to an electric car, very difficult to go back. No, that person loves the electric car, and as you get more and more of these converts, initially it's only the early adopters, the people that wanna maybe have the image, but as you start convincing more and more customers, you create this snowball effect, and the trend will accelerate. So the challenge at the beginning is, how do I reach this critical mass quickly, no? In whichever country, and for that you need innovation, and perhaps you need a bit of incentives that are very targeted and very clear at the beginning. And they don't need to be necessarily economic incentive. In a lot of cities, we see, for example, access to parking for electric vehicles, or access to some congested areas of the city where only electric vehicles can enter. So those are also very innovative ways, no, of promoting the speed of penetration. So I do believe that we need to be optimistic. I think this trend will continue and will accelerate. And I hope it's primarily based on innovation and entrepreneurial spirit.
Thank you very much. So something that obviously it's in the mind of electric utilities worldwide. Rodolfo, let's start with you. But as we shift more personal energy consumption to electricity, the resiliency becomes an issue. Reliability of the grid and the customers, the residents, the community resiliency becomes a major issue. If your house doesn't have electricity, you can get in your car and drive somewhere if you need something. If you have a car, or you can get on public transportation, if these things are electrified, then especially large scale community or regional outages become really critical. From the Latin American perspective, what do you think needs to happen before you can effectively and safely shift not just transportation over to the same energy source that we're using in our buildings and in our companies?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Great question. And clearly, I think we need to modernize the grids. The significant investment will be needed to provide the required flexibility. And we're already seeing some challenges with the growth of renewable energies in many countries in the region, where by introducing these new sources of energy into the mix, you are also creating challenges for the transmission and the distribution of the energy. So it's very important to plan very clearly what are those capabilities and what is the flexibility that the national grid needs to have. And the utilities clearly play a big role here. No, they need to be at the upfront in terms of preparing their systems for these new models, no, which are going to be more dynamic. We're going to have players not only importing energy from the grid, but also exporting to the grids. Even homeowners could export energy to the grid. So to really maximize the benefits, I do think that it's important to bring the best available technologies, modernize these grids, have all homes connected with smart meters, and really have a real technological revolution here that will help kind of get the biggest bang for the investment.
Okay, great. Anyone else on the resiliency, reliability of the grid?
Yeah.
With respect to EVs. Ashley.
Oh, sorry, Michael.
Go ahead.
I'll be quick. I know we've got some great contributions here. Yeah, I think you hit it on. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think in addition to investing in our grid, I think this is an opportunity for us in this challenge to, we need power solutions like microgrid technology to enhance the national grid. I think the facility energy management is going to be a pretty key component to inefficient utilization of our energy that we can repurpose for EV infrastructure. To Michael's earlier point, I was thinking when you were talking, I was thinking, so we had worked on a project with Montgomery County in Maryland, partnered with Schneider, and we repurposed their energy efficiencies at some of their facilities at their public safety headquarters. And we have this Brookville smart bus depot. And, in many ways, I think sometimes the difficulty is, your customers trying to project out the full scope of what their intentions are with their fleet. But sometimes it's really important just to start somewhere and to really prepare for the future. If you don't have the buses yet, but really building the infrastructure, I can't stress that enough. Britta, you alluded to the utility interconnect timeline. So that also applies to the medium heavy duty. Sometimes we're getting the customers that are purchasing these vehicles, and then they think they can couple that initially right out of the gate with the infrastructure, but oftentimes they're getting the vehicle before they're getting the charger. And so it's incumbent upon our industry really to ready these customers. And sometimes it's tricky with how they procure equipment and vehicles, but in order to accelerate that, we need to think creatively about microgrids and flexibility there on the bus front, but also on the trucks and light duty as well.
I mean, I'll add my 2 cents on this one too. And that is just stepping back and looking at the big picture and not losing sight of a higher bar for electric vehicles than gasoline vehicles. Every time one of these storms comes out and wipes out a refinery, we also have oil shortages all over the country, or liquid oxygen, shortages. I mean, just things happen constantly. I also lived through the Northeast power outage up while I was in Michigan, and we didn't have power for a week. What also didn't we have? Gas stations. So again, everything is really interconnected here. I think the really big thing to understand here is, again, I'm going to go back to the transportation and the grid interface. Here in Florida, we only have access to solar. All right. We're aiming for 51% solar and storage by 2030, and then 100% thereafter. There's not enough wind. There's not enough transmission system coming in here to Florida to deal with this. So storage is really important because we've got cloud cover and storms and rain. That same storage means if we can be efficient about the way we're charging vehicles and we manage that charging to the right times of day and the right, configurations and situations, it means that the same storage that makes the grid more resilient can help us with vehicle charging in those times when the grid goes down. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here, but gas is not perfect either.
Great, thank you. Michael?
We're moving to a electrified future. There's no question. In many ways, in many places, we need to up the resiliency of the grid. We need to harden the grid. There's just no question. The public is skeptical, and we just got to recognize that and deliver on it. Because if we're at where we are today, it will be a problem, and people will reject it. So we got to get better.
Great. Okay, we have just a few minutes left. So if anyone has anything they'd like to leave our audience with, very quickly, 30 to 60 seconds, let's have it. Michael?
I would say that we can, right from the beginning, we cannot forget that for this transition to work, we have to bring all people along. So in the United States, we have to bring people in every community along. This can't be just a solution focused on the rich or the well-off. We have to think about communities whose primary concern is not greenhouse gas, but local air quality, emissions, and their cost. And that's true on the global stage as well. If we don't get that right up front, I probably should add that to my list, people just won't go along with this. So I would just say let's all keep that in mind in all the things we work on.
Yeah, I'll double down
Great,
on
thank
that
you,
one.
Mike.
Michael, I'll double down on that one on access in low-income communities. We just got done studying the Los Angeles market, looking at high mileage ride-hailing vehicles side by side, Ubers and Lyfts driving. And we looked at the EVs versus the gas vehicles. Where are the chargers today? They're all in the wealthy parts of town. Where are the EVs driving in Uber and Lyft fleets? In the wealthy areas of town. Where are the gas emissions still coming out of the tailpipes of vehicles? In low-income areas, even though almost half of all rides stop or begin or end in those low-income areas, and even though most drivers live in those same low-income communities. So even today, with the little bit of infrastructure we've got out there today, is already not on the right path to equitable access.
Great. Ashley, Rodolfo?
Rodolfo, I know you haven't had, I'll let you go first.
Thank you, Ashley. No, I like to say that I think that the electrification of mobility is going to be one of the greatest technological revolutions of this decade. And it's a very exciting trend, and it will have tremendous benefits. It's not easy. It has a lot of challenges, but I think with as mentioned before, with the strong cooperation of public policymakers, private sector, innovators, etc., there will be great advances initially in the developed markets, but this will trickle down later on to emerging economies like Latin America that will benefit from cheaper batteries and more accessible electric cars. So I think it's an exciting trend. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Ashley, I think you get the last word.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, we've covered so much, but one thing I would just add is I think it's important for all of us within our corporations to clean up our own house too, not to disregard, the work that we're doing with our partners, but whether it's, electrifying your fleet, making sure that your distributors and the partners that you work with from a supply chain, I think that'll have ripple effects beyond, anything that we can imagine. I think I would just recommend emboldening, delegating, whether it's in your workforce internally or with partners, because I think the more people we can bring into this bubble of ours that started out small, I think we will continue to succeed. I think, looking to leaders like, GM and some of the other partners, Ford, all the other automakers, just supporting as much as we can and accelerating those choices for consumers. And yeah, the energy equity question, I think the more that we can, increase smart connected grid vehicles, I think it's going to bring the cost down for everybody, from an electricity cost standpoint. And we all know that, but I think that's a good message to continue to prevail. So let's continue to decarbonize and digitize all these good things, but, take care of yourself first too.
Okay, thank you. That is a great way to end this. So thank you all. To our audience, our participants, I hope you have a great World Energy Week, and thank you very much.
Mark, thank you very much for a super session. I learned a lot over the course of the hour. Each of the panelists, I thought, contributed in a very significant way. What were my takeaways? It was good to get the size of the ambition for electrification of the car fleet in the US, the numbers associated with that. We got very specific rather than generic. I thought that was good. I'll come back on that. I thought it was also interesting to get the perspective of Latin America versus the US and the challenges, therefore, that basically Latin America faces as it thinks about electrification. We did hear different perspectives. Sometimes when we think about EVs, we think about potentially just the consumer using EVs in various parts of the world. But we did get different perspectives that there are different ways to tackle the electrification issue for transportation. Again, some points on that. I thought it was very good to get the challenge of what we need to get right now in 2021 if we're to get to some of these ambitious targets in 2030. Obviously, with the electrification of mobility comes the challenge of grid resilience, and you can't obviously move forward with electrification of the vehicle fleet if we don't think about some of the real challenges that are faced for the grid as we go forward. And again, I think coming back to our overall theme, for Energy Week of Energy for Better Lives, it was interesting to get the final comments about the importance of bringing communities along as we think about this change in our mobility and the different ways in which electrification will happen. And there were some comments with regard to the divide that does exist between low-income communities in some parts of the US and high-income, and where infrastructure is going. Perhaps no surprise it's going to the high-income, but that obviously leads to a community divide, which needs to be overcome as we think about these massive changes. So let's go back to some of the points about ambition. So again, we heard that there are 2 million vehicles, electric vehicles in the US. 7 years ago, there were 1 million, or it took 7 years to get to 1 million. It's taken 4 years to get to 2 million. So progress, as was being stated. But we need to get to somewhere between 50 and 70 million electric vehicles on the road in the US by 2030, 2035. That's an enormous change of the fleet that will need to happen, the vehicle fleet in the US over that period of time. And then I thought it got very kind of tangible when we think about if there are 50 million vehicles thereabouts in 2030, that means we'll need about 300,000 fast chargers, not the other type of chargers. And that means that we'll have to start building 500 chargers a week today, as in starting this week, if we're going to get to that target. And obviously, we're some way off that. However, that ambition, I felt, was matched by the comments that came from the Department of Energy. In other words, it was really encouraging to get the Department of Energy talking about their ambition, their recognition of the challenge, and what they believe they need to get right to meet some of those ambitious targets. But those targets are real, they are ambitious, and they will be difficult to get to. And we won't get to them, obviously, without policymakers supporting us as we go forward. Again, it was interesting just to get the perspective of Latin America, and that perspective was brought into, I thought, sharp focus when we think about the income difference that sits between the US and, for example, Mexico. And as a result of that, if we are ambitious with electrification in the US, the reality is that we just can't afford to move to an electrification agenda of that vehicle fleet in parts of Latin America at the pace that we're seeing in other parts of the world. And I think that then led, however, to the discussion with regard to, we often think about passenger vehicles as where we should focus on as in terms of the electrification. But as was mentioned, actually we can make real progress when we think about public transport. So we can go to cities like Mexico City, which clearly is suffering in the context of emissions and what the impact that it is having on the quality of life. Any of us who visited Mexico City or any of these large cities will know that. And if we can make real progress on public transportation in the immediacy, then that actually will be progress. It won't be the electrification of the entire fleet that we were talking about when we talked about the US, but it does demonstrate there are different ways of getting to where we need to get to by 2030 and beyond. And I thought the other aspect that came through on this is that, again, when we think passenger vehicles, we understand that as one thing perhaps in the developed world, but in India and China we can be thinking about three-wheel vehicles, or those last mile vehicles. In other words, there are other ways in which we can think about electrification that allow part of the developing world to accelerate in this journey over the course of the next 10 years or so. And in terms of what we need to get right now, again, it was interesting because this, I think, is consistent across all energy systems. What was heightened was tightened standards. We have too many standards, which creates inoperability with regard to the vehicle fleet when it comes into the energy system. We need permits. Again, it was mentioned that to get a permit for a charging station perhaps takes between 170 and 150 days. And there are perhaps good reasons why it's taking that long, but clearly we're not going to get to where we need to be if we continue to take between 170 to 150 days. We need to get regulation coming together in the different areas that they are controlled such that we can unify on standards and accelerate the way in which we move forward. We need to be focusing on R&D on batteries. Battery technology obviously will be critical to this, and we need to bring down that cost sooner rather than later. And that will only happen if we redirect research and R&D into that particular area as we go forward. And the other aspect that came through associated with battery was raw material diversifications. If we think about the hydrocarbon energy system as of today, with the price of crude going beyond 80 yesterday and the issues we've got associated with gas at the moment, in other words, we have bottlenecks between supply and demand, we are likely to see those bottlenecks also on raw materials that will be needed for our battery fleets of the future. And that will need to be dealt with sooner rather than later. I think in terms of one of the aspects that came through on the grid challenge is that Resilience will be critical. Resilience of our infrastructure, and grids are not as resilient as they need to be, and the integration of a mobility fleet into the grid will bring great challenges. But that also linked to some interesting insight into different ownership models associated with our vehicle fleet. And one of the models that was mentioned was that actually when we think about the requirement for storage, then the battery that would go into a car could in fact be leased to you as an owner, and ultimately that battery can have a secondary purpose, a secondary use, and be used as storage within the grid system, because we will need much more storage within our energy system as we go forward. And again, different models, different ways of thinking will be needed to overcome this as we go forward. And then finally, this issue about bringing communities along. We will need new infrastructure, which again will need to be built. And that infrastructure might impose itself on different communities or might create challenges for communities to accept that infrastructure will need to be built in their backyard to enable a new mobility system to emerge that is electrified and sits on a new smart grid. And we need to do that, and we also need to understand where this investment is going. And if it is just going to the richer parts of communities and urban environments, then we are leaving behind large sections of a society, and that won't lead to energy for better lives, which is obviously one of the principles that we've put behind World Energy Week this week. So again, a fantastic session. I thought some really good insights with real specific numbers and challenges. I thought an enormous challenge ahead of us, but I did feel that each of the participants were optimistic about that if we bring ourselves together on this, then actually we can overcome some of those challenges and move forward. But action needs to happen now. There was a real urgency, I felt, in each of the panelists in terms of what we need to do to bring a different system for mobility, not just in the developed world, but in the developing world as well. So we'll pause there. We're going to come back in about 5 minutes. We have our last session for the day, which is going to be a global plenary called Humanizing Energy, Meeting the Enablers of the Transition. Something a little bit different. I think we're quite excited to launch this, but I'll come back in about 5 minutes' time and we'll launch that properly. Thank you, everyone. And once again, thank you, Mark, for a fantastic session.